The wind arrived before midnight. It came from the northwest, as it always did in that valley, rolling down off the ridge in long, low waves that pressed against every wall, every seam, every gap a man had left between one log and the next. January of 1874 had been building toward this for weeks, tightening its grip day by day, and now it finally closed its fist. In the settlement scattered along the eastern flank of the Allegheny foothills, 11 families burned through their wood piles with a kind of quiet desperation. The fires roared for an hour, maybe two, and then the cold crept back in, through the floor, to the northern wall, to the thin pine doors warped by 3 seasons of weather. Children slept in layers of wool and canvas. Women kept cast-iron pots on the coals through the night, to hold any warmth they could. Men woke at 2 a.m. to feed fires that should have lasted until dawn. One cabin was different. From the outside, it barely looked like a cabin at all. A second wooden frame rose around it, rough-cut pine boards nailed to the skeleton of posts, 3 walls deep, wrapping the main structure on the north, west, and east sides like a crude outer shell. Neighbors had been talking about that shell since September. Most of what they said wasn't kind. But on this particular night, with the temperature dropping below -8 degrees Fahrenheit, -22 degrees Celsius, and the wind making the timber groan, the man inside that cabin sat by a steady fire burning clean, dry wood. His interior wall thermometer, a simple mercury instrument he'd carried from Pennsylvania, held between 64 degrees Fahrenheit and 67 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 to 19 degrees Celsius, through the worst hours of the storm. He burned less than half a face cord through the entire night. His neighbors, in identical-sized cabins, burned nearly twice that. He didn't go outside to say anything. He didn't need to. The wood was dry. The show was working. And winter, indifferent as always, was making his case for him. If you've ever wondered how frontier settlers manage brutal winters with almost nothing, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We're building a library of forgotten frontier engineering, and you won't want to miss what's coming. To understand what Elias Cord built and why it mattered, you have to understand what the northern frontier demanded of man in the early 1870s. The settlement had taken root in 1869, carved from second-growth timber along a creek drainage that fed into the larger river valley 20 miles south. It was not a harsh place by the standards of the northern Great Plains. There were trees, there was water, and the soil was workable. But the winters were long and wet, the kind that never committed to a clean freeze. Rain came in November, turned to sleet in December, and by January the ground was a mix of ice and mud that made hauling anything a misery. Firewood was the central currency of survival. A family of 4 needed between 12 and 18 cords of seasoned hardwood to heat a standard single-room cabin through a full winter. That was a common estimate passed between settlers, though local accounts suggest the number ran higher in bad years. Close to 20 cords when the cold came early and the wood was green. Cutting, splitting, and hauling that volume of wood represented somewhere between 60 and 90 days of labor over the course of a year. For a man already clearing land, maintaining animals, and building a permanent structure, that was a number that never quite balanced. The cabins themselves made the problem worse. Pioneer construction of that era was built for speed, not efficiency. A single-room log structure of roughly 16 by 20 feet, for 0.9 by 6.1 meters, could be raised by a crew of 6 men in 3 to 4 days using butt end pass or saddle notch joinery. Fast, functional, and brutally cold. The walls were typically 1 log thick, 8 to 10 inches, 20 to 25 centimeters, of wood with chinking of clay, moss, or whatever material was available. On the northern and western exposures, where prevailing winds struck directly, that wall thickness was rarely enough. Heat radiated outward almost as fast as a fireplace produced it. Firewood stacking compounded everything. Most settlers arranged their winter supply against the south or east wall of the cabin, covered with a sheet of bark or a simple lean-to roof. If they covered it at all, would expose the snow and rain for weeks absorbed moisture deep into the grain. Green or wetwood burns at a combustion efficiency roughly 40% lower than properly seasoned dry wood. It produces more smoke, more creosote, less heat per pound, and a fire that demands constant attention to stay alive. It was a system that worked well enough in mild years. In hard ones, it killed. Elias Cord had spent his first winter in the settlement. 1872 to 1873, watching all of this very carefully. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes from working with wood for a long time. Elias had spent 11 years in a sawmill in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, before the death of his wife, and a long, restless spring convinced him to move west. He understood with the way a man understands a language he grew up speaking, not through rules, but through the grain and weight and smell of it. He knew how green oak held its moisture through a full year of stacking. He knew the difference between the clean crack of a dry split and the dull thud of waterlogged pine. He knew, more than most men in the settlement, how much heat a cord of properly dried hardwood actually contained, and how much of that heat was wasted when the wood wasn't ready. During his first winter, he kept a rough mental ledger. A neighbor to his north, a man named Walter Pruitt, who'd come down from Ontario with a wife and 3 sons, burned to what appeared to be 15 cords between November and March. The cabin was no larger than Elias's own, roughly 320 square feet, 29.7 square meters of interior space. The fire ran all day, banked at night, and still the family wore coats indoors through February. The walls wept condensation in the mornings. The chinking had cracked and been repacked twice already. To the west, a young couple named the Sheffields had stacked their wood directly against the west-facing wall, uncovered. By January, the outer 3 rows had frozen solid and needed to be thawed by the fire before they'd catch a flame. They burned what Elias estimated to be nearly double the heat value they were actually extracting from their wood. The rest went up the chimney as steam and smoke, or simply never ignited at all. The problem wasn't laziness or ignorance. These were capable, hard-working people. The problem was structural. The system everyone was using had never been optimized. It had simply been inherited, copied from the cabin before it and the one before that, passed down through a tradition that confused familiarity with efficiency. Wet wood, cold walls, no buffer between the interior and the wind. 3 separate failures that everyone had accepted as inevitable. Elias did not accept them as inevitable. That spring, April of 1873, when the mud had firm enough to walk on, he began sketching in a small brown notebook he kept inside his coat. The sketches were rough. Planned views of his cabin, arrows showing wind direction, measurement of wall thickness, and on the 4th page, the first outline of something his neighbors had never seen and would spend the next 5 months making fun of. Elias Cord was not an easy man to know. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, lean and deliberate in the way that men who work with heavy machinery tend to be, always aware of where his hands were, always thinking 2 steps ahead of the task in front of him. He didn't talk much at the communal meals or the occasional Saturday gatherings at the Pruitt cabin, but when he did speak, people remembered what he said. He had the kind of quiet that isn't shyness but calculation. What most of his neighbors didn't know was how much of his time, through that first winter and into the spring, he had spent simply watching. He watched the snow. Specifically, he watched where it drifted, always to the lee side of structures, always deepest along the north and west faces where the wind compressed and released. A drift 4 feet, 1.2 meters, deep against a cabin wall was not just an inconvenience. It was insulation in its own crude way. He'd noticed that the Pruitt cabin, despite burning enormous quantities of wood, stayed marginally warmer on the nights when the snow had built up against its north wall. Not because snow was warm, because it blocked the wind. He watched the trees. Old-growth hardwoods on the exposed ridge lost their bark on the windward side. The timber that had stood for a century had learned to present its densest face to the prevailing northwest flow. Elias filed that away. He watched his own walls at night, holding a candle near the chinking and watching the flame bend. Cold air was infiltrating the cabin at dozens of points, invisible leaks that the fire had to constantly compensate for. Every draft was heat, leaving the room. Every gap in the chinking was a small, continuous defeat. By May of 1873, the sketch in his notebook had evolved into something specific. He was going to build a second structure around his cabin, not a lean-to against one wall, a full 3-sided enclosure, a weather shell that would wrap the north, west, and east faces of the main building. The gap between the outer shell and the cabin wall would be approximately 18 to 24 inches, 46 to 61 centimeters. That gap would serve 2 functions simultaneously: It would act as a dead air buffer, dramatically reducing convective heat loss through the cabin walls, and it would provide covered, ventilated storage for his entire winter firewood supply. 2 problems. 1, structure. He started buying extra lumber in June, before the summer prices rose. His neighbor Walter Pruitt watched him unload the second cartload of boards and called across the fence with a grin. "Building yourself a barn, Elias? Thought you didn't keep cattle." Elias stacked the lumber without turning around. "Not a barn," he said. "A coat." Pruitt laughed. It was a good laugh, genuine, neighborly. He'd remember that exchange differently come February. Before we get to what happened when winter finally arrived, make sure you subscribed and left a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. There are dozens of stories like this one buried in Frontier records, and we're just getting started. Construction began on a Monday in late June, when the ground was firm and the days were long enough to work 16 hours without a lantern. Elias had thought through the design over the course of 3 months, and by the time he drove the first post into the earth, there was nothing improvised about it. He knew exactly what he was building, and exactly why each dimension mattered. The outer frame rose on a foundation of flat fieldstone, limestone slabs he collected from the creek drainage over 2 seasons, each one hand-fitted without mortar into a dry stack course that sat roughly 4 inches, 10 centimeters, above grade. No concrete, no lime mix, just stone on stone, selected for flatness and weight. The purpose was twofold: to keep the base of the outer wall from direct contact with the wet ground, and provide a thermal anchor, a dense, slow-changing mass at the base of the structure that would resist the nightly temperature swings that made frontier winters so punishing. Above the stone course, he erected a skeleton of rough-sawn posts at 48-inch, 122 centimeters, intervals, braced at the corners with diagonal strapping to resist wind load. The outer sheathing was vertical pine board and batten, the same construction he'd used on the cabin itself, with a deliberate gap of 3/4 of an inch, about 2 centimeters, left between boards at the bottom course to allow air to circulate upward through the wall cavity. This was not an accident. Elias understood, from his years at the mill, that trapped moisture was the enemy of wood. The shell needed to breathe, or it would rot from the inside. The gap between the shell and the cabin wall, that critical 20-inch, 51 centimeters, buffer, was the heart of the design. Dead air is one of the most effective thermal insulators known to vernacular builders. It cannot convect efficiently in a narrow, enclosed space. It cannot conduct heat the way a solid material can. It simply sits, changing temperature slowly, acting as a thermal break between the cold outside and the warm interior wall. The principle was not new. It appeared in various forms in Norse construction, in the double-wall design of certain Scandinavian farmhouses, and in the earthen berms that Great Plains settlers piled against their sod house walls. What was unusual was Elias's decision to make that buffer space functional rather than empty. He filled it with firewood, from floor to ceiling on the north and west sections of the shell, the 2 faces that took the worst of prevailing wind. He stacked split hardwood in tight, alternating rows, a method millers called rick stacking, which maximized airflow around each piece while maintaining structural density in the pile. The wood was cut in May, split in June, and stacked immediately inside the shell where it would spend the summer and fall dry in the ventilated cavity. By October, local accounts suggest the interior would have reached a moisture content of roughly 18 to 20%, well within a range that burns cleanly and efficiently, compared to the 30 to 45% moisture content common in what's stacked outdoors under a simple lean-to. The east section of the shell was left partially open at the top, a covered passage, essentially allowing Elias to move wood from the stack directly into the cabin without stepping outside into a blizzard. In a winter storm, that detail alone was worth more than it might appear. Moving firewood in -15 degrees Fahrenheit, -26 degrees Celsius wind takes heat from the body faster than most people anticipate. Every trip eliminated was a calorie saved, a risk reduced. By August, the structure was complete. It stood perhaps 14 feet for 0.3 meters at its ridge, tight-fitting around the cabin like a second skin, functional, unglamorous, and unlike anything else in the settlement. Elias stood back and looked at it for a long moment. Then he went inside and made coffee. The comments started before the shell was even finished. Owen Marsh was the settlement's most experienced builder, a man who had framed houses in Ohio before moving west, and who carried that credential with the quiet authority of someone who had never been seriously wrong about a structural question. He walked by Elias's property on a Thursday afternoon in July, stopped at the fence, and studied the rising outer frame for a long moment with his arms crossed. "You're going to trap moisture in that cavity," he said finally. "Wood against wood, no ventilation worth mentioning. You'll have rot in both walls by spring." Elias explained the bottom course gap, the board and batten spacing, the deliberate airflow design. Marsh listened with the patient expression of a man who has already made up his mind. "It's wasteful," Marsh said. "All that timber for a woodshed you could have built in a day. A proper lean-to on the south face, bark roof. For posts, that's what works. Been working for 30 years. He wasn't wrong that the lean-to worked. It did work after fashion. But Elias had spent a winter watching exactly how well it worked, and the answer was, not well enough. Walter Pruitt was less technical in his objections and more direct. He called the structure a house for a house on at least 3 separate occasions, which the settlement apparently found funnier each time. The phrase made the rounds. By August, it had become a fixture at Saturday gatherings. Someone would spot Elias across the clearing and nudge the man next to them, and the phrase would pass through the group like a small, satisfied ripple. The Sheffield boy, young Caleb, maybe 19, stood at the edge of Elias's property one afternoon and asked, with genuine curiosity rather than malice, whether Elias was planning to build a third structure around the second one, and then a fourth around that, until eventually the whole property was nothing but nested shells going outward to the tree line. Elias looked at him for a moment. "Might," he said. "Depends on the winter." What none of the critics fully engaged with was a question Elias had actually been asking himself for 18 months. Not is this a traditional way, but does the traditional way work well enough? The lean-to was sufficient in a mild winter. So were thin walls, unchinked gaps, and green would burn fast and wastefully. Sufficient was a standard that kept people alive in average years. Elias was not interested in average years. He was interested in the years that killed. Owen Marsh built a fine lean-to that summer. For posts, bark roof, south-facing. He stacked his wood under it in October with the confidence of a man who had done this correctly for 3 decades. The wood sat exposed to the north wind on 3 sides throughout November and December, absorbing moisture from every rain and every thaw-freeze cycle. By January, it had a surface frost on the outer rows that took a full hour by the fire to drive out before the wood would catch reliably. Marsh said nothing about this, but he noticed the tension in the settlement that autumn was not dramatic or confrontational. It was quieter than that. The particular social discomfort of a community that is committed collectively to a method and is now watching one of its members quietly refuse to commit alongside them. Frontier communities ran on shared practice. Deviation was inefficiency at best, arrogance at worst. Elias understood this. He had grown up in such a community. He knew that the only argument that would ever be accepted was the one winter made for him. So he stacked his wood, finished his shell, and waited. The winter of 1873 to 1874 arrived 11 days ahead of the seasonal average, or so local records of that region suggest, based on the account of settlers who noted the first hard freeze in their diaries and letters. By the second week of November, the temperature had dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius and held there. The creek froze from the banks inward, the mud turned to iron overnight, and the settlement began particular arithmetic of a northern winter. How much remains? How much cold is left? How long must each cord last? December was manageable. Most families had adequate supplies. The fires were still burning through seasoned outer rows of their stacks, and the cold, while persistent, had not yet become cruel. There was even a thaw in the third week. 2 days of temperatures climbing back above freezing, rain falling, and then a hard snap that encased everything in a 1/4 inch, 6 millimeters, of ice. That ice event mattered more than anyone initially recognized. It sealed the surface of every uncovered or poorly covered woodpile in the settlement under a shell that took real effort to break through. More critically, it drove moisture back into wood that had been making progress toward dryness through the autumn. Walter Pruitt spent a morning with an axe cracking ice off his outer stack. Owen Marsh reported later that his lean-to had shed the rain adequately, but done nothing to stop the ice from forming on the exposed faces. Inside Elias's shell, the firewood was untouched. January broke open in the first week with a clarity and force that left no room for misunderstanding. A high-pressure system settled over the region and refused to move for nearly 3 weeks. Night temperatures reached minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 23 degrees Celsius, and on 3 consecutive nights in the second week dropped to what Elias recorded in his notebook as below the instrument's reliable range, likely minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius, or colder. The wind returned from the northwest, steady and hard, pressing against every structure in the valley with a force that made the log walls creak. The settlement burned through wood at a rate that alarmed everyone. Pruitt's family, 4 adults and 2 children by that winter, went through what he estimated as nearly a full cord in 5 days. The fire ran continuously, banked only briefly in the deepest part of the night, and still the interior temperature of his cabin dropped to the low 40s Fahrenheit, around 5 to 7 degrees Celsius, by morning. His wife began heating stones on a hearth and wrapping them in cloth to place at the foot of the children's sleeping pallets. An old technique, practical and effective, but a signal that the fire alone was no longer sufficient. The Sheffield cabin, with its west-facing woodpile exposed directly to prevailing wind, was burning wetwood by the second week of January. Caleb Sheffield told Elias later that the fire would build for 20 minutes and then settle into a low, sullen burn that produced more smoke than heat. The green and rain soak would releasing its moisture as steam before it could fully combust. The interior temperature, he said, never climbed above 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius on the coldest nights, no matter how much they fed the fire. Elias's cabin held 64 degrees Fahrenheit to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 to 20 degrees Celsius, through the same nights. His mercury thermometer, hung on the interior north wall, the coldest face, recorded those numbers consistently from the first week of January through the 3rd. He was burning dry hardwood split the previous May, moisture content estimated at 18% or below, producing a clean, hot, efficient combustion that left almost no unburned residue in the firebox. He fed the fire twice in the night rather than 4 or 5 times. He burned, by his own careful estimation, roughly 6 to 7 split pieces per hour during peak cold, compared to 10 to 12 pieces per hour his neighbors were consuming for inferior results. Over the course of the 3-week cold snap, Elias's consumption ran approximately 30 to 35% below what comparable cabins in the settlement required. He finished the winter with nearly 3 cords of wood remaining in the shell. Pruitt ran out his primary stack in late February and spent 2 weeks burning green timber he'd cut in January, a desperate, inefficient measure that produced heavy creosote deposits in his chimney and a fire that barely justified its own smoke. The numbers were not a surprise to Elias. He had expected them, or something close to them. What surprised him quietly was the look on Walter Pruitt's face the morning after the worst night of the cold snap, when Pruitt walked over to return a borrowed auger and found Elias sitting on his covered porch, the porch that opened into the shell passage, drinking coffee in a wool shirt without a coat, the interior of the shell around him radiating the warmth of 10,000 board feet of slowly drying wood, the cabin behind him holding its heat, like a hell breath. Pruitt stood at the fence for a long moment. "How warm is it in there?" he asked. Elias told him the number. Pruitt didn't say anything. He handed back the auger, nodded once, and walked home. By the following September, 3 families in the settlement had begun building their own versions of the weather shell. Pruitt was first. He approached Elias in late April, after the snow had finally left the ground and the creek had dropped back within its banks. He came with his hat in his hands. Not literally, but in the manner of a man who has spent several weeks rehearsing a conversation he'd rather not have. He said he'd been thinking about the structure, said he wanted to understand it properly before he tried to build one himself. Elias spent 2 afternoons walking him through it. The stone foundation course and why it mattered, the board and batten spacing, and the bottom course airflow gap, the rick stacking method and its effect on drying time, the 20-inch buffer and the physics of dead air insulation. Pruitt listened carefully this time, without the grin he'd carried through the summer before. Owen Marsh took longer. He was a proud man in a particular way of skilled tradesman who had built a reputation on knowing what works, and being told that something works better is, for such a man, not a simple thing to absorb. He spent most of the spring insisting that Elias had benefited from favorable conditions, an unusually well-chinked wall, perhaps a better grade of timber. But when he finally built his own shell in the late summer of 1874, he built it carefully and correctly, with the bottom course gap and the rick-stacked interior and the covered passage on the east face. He never publicly acknowledged that he'd changed his mind, but the shell went up, and it stayed up for years afterward. The Sheffields didn't need much convincing. Caleb Sheffield had been 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius cold for 3 weeks. He built his shell in August with lumber he'd been cutting since May, and by October his wood was drying under cover in a ventilated cavity, protected from every rain, every freeze, every thaw cycle that would have robbed it of its heat value the previous year. The concept spread beyond the settlement in the way that genuinely useful ideas spread on the frontier, not through pamphlets or patent filings, but through conversation at the mill, through travelers stopping for a night and noting the odd double structure, through letters sent back east describing what a man in the Allegheny foothills had figured out by watching snow drift and wood rot. By the early 1880s, variations of the weather shell appeared in homesteading guides and carpenter manuals circulating through the northern states and territories. Some called it a woodshed wrap. Others referred to it as a buffer enclosure or a winter vestibule. The terminology varied. The principle was the same, a secondary outer structure that simultaneously insulated the cabin wall, dried, and protected the firewood supply, and eliminated the exposure penalty that frontier settlers had been paying in labor and cold and wasted wood since the first cabins went up. It was not a miracle. It was geometry and air and dry wood burning the way dry wood is supposed to burn. Elias Cord did not seek recognition for it. He was not that kind of man. He lived in the settlement for another 11 years, kept his shell in good repair, restacked his wood every June, and burned clean fires through every winter that followed. When he finally left the valley in 1885, headed farther west by most accounts, he left the shell standing. The family that moved into the cabin after him used it for 2 more decades without fully understanding what had been designed into it or why. They just knew it would stay dry, and the cabin stayed warm. There's a particular kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself. It watches, measures, and builds, and then lets the winter make the argument. Elias Cord was not an inventor. He was an observer. He looked at a problem everyone else had accepted as permanent, identified 3 specific mechanical failures behind it, and solved all 3 with a single structure made from common materials and common sense. The frontier is full of stories like his. Most of them were never written down. They were passed from hand to hand, from carpenter to apprentice, from father to son, and then gradually lost as new materials and new methods made the old questions seem obsolete. But the old questions are never really obsolete. How do you keep heat in? How do you keep moisture out? How do you do more with less in a place where there is never quite enough of anything? The answers, it turns out, were already built. Somewhere along a creek drainage in the Allegheny foothills, in the winter of 1873 to 1874, they were proven once again. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about dead air gaps in dry wood and the man who built a coat for his cabin, then you already understand why this channel exists. Hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Every week we go looking for the engineering that the frontier figured out and the modern world forgot. The next story is already waiting. Educational and historical content. This screenplay is a verisimilar reconstruction based on frontier-era building practices and plausible period conditions. Character names, specific dialogue, and precise measurements represent informed narrative reconstruction. This content does not substitute for professional engineering, construction, or fire safety guidance.